Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and this is Rocha. And for your kind information, I've been making several videos on nursing research. And if you haven't subscribed my channel, you can subscribe and you can view all those videos what we have gone through. For today, I would like to share regarding sampling bias and sampling errors, which are asked for 5 marks as well as 2 marks questions. And this is also very important topic. As a research students, you have a project which needs to be done in your undergraduate programs and postgraduate programs as well. You need to finish your dissertation. You need to understand these two concepts, sampling bias and sampling errors, before selecting a sample or estimating a sample, how much sample to take. So let's just have an understanding about these two topics. What is sampling bias? It refers to the systematic overrepresentation or underrepresentation of some segments of population in terms of characteristics relevant to the research question. So when we say bias, we said like in doing some experiments or research experimental designs, we have seen like bias. It should be free from bias, personal opinions or objectivity, what we said, like personal interests of the researcher, or just for convenience sake we try to take a small sample, whichever is available, convenient, without knowing how much sample to take, etc. All these sampling bias, they refer to the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of some segments of population. Already in my previous video we have seen what is meant by population. It is a universe or characteristics of a person where we want to conduct a research, certain populations, certain people, or certain segments or clusters where researcher wants to conduct a research. So sometimes when we select that sample, it might be over representation or under representation. Another definition of it, it is a tendency to favor a selection of sample units that possess particular characteristics. Who will favor? The researcher will favor that. So this can lead to sampling bias. As already discussed, a researcher would work with samples and not the whole population. So from the whole population we will select target population. From that, whichever participants or subjects or samples are accessible, the researcher would like to include in the study. So it is in the researcher's hands how he designs his research and on whom he wants to select, and what the sample, where he wants to select, and how much sample he wants to select. So conducting a study on whole population is time consuming as well as expensive process. So we do this sampling process and select a sample so that which could represent the whole population, and we conduct a study and the study findings are generalized to the whole population. So here, if there is an over-representation or under-representation, this could lead to sampling bias as well as sampling errors. So it may not, if we just over-represent or under-represent, it will not lead to logical conclusions. We will just have a look at what it is in detail. Inadequate sampling will also lead to sampling bias, which usually occurs unconsciously if the researcher is not aware of how to select a sample, how much to select, and if he is not cautious about these biases or sampling errors, then this might occur. Suppose a researcher has a plan of conducting a study on nursing students systematically, or interviewing nursing student every 10th nursing student who enters into a library or a studying room, in this way also bias can occur, because he is not consciously aware of which student, what is the appearance, what is the gender, what are the traits of the student. Unconsciously this can occur. So researcher wants to conduct a study, and he wants to conduct on every 10 student whoever is entering into the study room or a reading room. So in that way also sometimes it can lead to bias. Coming to types of sampling bias. First one, self-selection bias or voluntary response bias. So here it occurs because it depends upon the participant. Participant has a choice. He might be required to involve in study, but the participant might refuse to involve in study, because it's the participant choice whether to involve in it or not. So that bias is called as self-selection bias or voluntary response bias. Under coverage bias. Respondents or samples are not taken from segment of population. Researcher ignores some population or some sample, either consciously or unconsciously. He ignores some population. That will lead to under coverage bias. Next one, exclusion bias. Researcher deliberately excludes some sample or population. So here deliberately excludes means sometimes in some experimental studies, a researcher has that control, and he does this randomization and he manipulates the environments that time. If the participants are not meeting the criteria, or if he finds it is not conducive with this sample, then he deliberately excludes some sample. It is done by the researcher. Here self-selection bias means participant is not willing. Under coverage bias means some segment of population or some people are not covered under the research. That's what we say under coverage. Exclusion means researcher deliberately ignores or excludes. He does not want to include those participants into the study. Next one, healthy user bias. Here, suppose if you are conducting a study on knowledge regarding menopause or among menopausal women or something like that, here we may get some participants who already know about what is menopause and what are the effects or what are the signs and symptoms of menopause. We may get participants or the subjects who already have knowledge regarding that topic and still willing to participate in the study. So what happens here? It influences the study conducted by the researcher. That's how it is. Healthy user bias. They have already some knowledge, sufficient knowledge about the topic which the researcher wants to conduct. Next one is non-responsive bias. So when we say non-responsive bias, it means like, suppose for example, if you are taking part in surveys and the survey is for 1 hour or something, the participants would like to skip some questions. They don't want to respond. Or suppose there are some questions related to our personal information, which is very sensitive, and you would not want to wish to answer that, isn't it? So you may not give the information which need to be provided for that study which is under research. So we don't give any answer for sensitive information. And suppose if a researcher is trying to conduct some study related to cell phone addiction or whatever it is, and he selects a sample and the sample is not used with cell phone, or if he doesn't have access for cell phone, then he may not be able to answer the questions related to cell phone addiction. So non-responsive bias means participant refuses to take part in certain areas of research. Next, coming to recall bias. So, for example, if we see like quasi experimental studies where you structure teaching programs which are delivered, which are done on the particular sample, pre-test is done, then intervention is given, then you go back for the post-test. Some participant might not remember what was told to them previously 10 days back or 15 days back. They cannot remember things. Here, or some might be having some memory issues. So here we call it them as recall bias. Participants cannot remember things or know exact information about them or has some memory issues, etc., etc. Sometimes if you're doing some researches on PTSDs, maybe they may not be able to recollect exactly everything what has happened during that time. Next one is observer bias. This is on the side of the researcher or who is observing. For example, when we are doing some experimental studies, researcher has his own bias. He expects something from the study and he will try to only observe things only that aspect. But the actual result, the true result or the true outcome might be different, and the researcher actually ignores the true outcome what he is seeing because he expects something else. So his hypothesis is something else. He expected something else far from the truth, what he sees. So here what happens is observer bias comes in place. When the researcher's expectations on research are not met, he ignores the actual true outcome of the research. This happens in experimental research and sometimes in qualitative studies also, like if you are trying to observe some lifestyles of people or cultures of people also, we assume something and go and something else happens, then there also observer bias will be occurring. Next one is survivorship bias. Now, when we say survivorship bias, here what happens is, suppose we want to do a study on a particular population, maybe some adolescents or someone like, and we select a sampling frame and we select a sample. And for that sample to participate in the survey, we give a pre-questionnaire whether which has certain criteria, whether they can fulfill that criteria or not, and if they fulfill that criteria, then the participant is selected. Like for example, if you want to get into an admission for BSc nursing, you have certain criteria, like you have to clear your intermediate, then now you have to clear your NEET exam, whether you're getting the required marks or not. So then only you are given admission. In a same way, if a researcher wants to conduct a study regarding diabetes among population 45 years to 50 years, prevalence of diabetes among 45 to 50 years old, male and female, the age might be like relevant 45 to 50 years, but he wants to select only those who are having diabetes and go for explore certain things on that. So when we say, oh no, I am not suffering with any diabetes nor hypertension, but my age is 45 years, but so here when it comes, I am not fulfilling the criteria of it. That's how it is. So here research focuses on the sample which survives certain selective criteria. Recently I have been answering some health surveys. So when they ask like what is your age, where are you staying, how many children you have, and all that, what is your annual income, everything I feed and I get a response, sorry, you don't match our criteria. So they ask like, do you have a TV in your home, or do you use two-wheeler, do you use these costumes, etc., etc., and all. So when I answer certain things, whether I fit into that criteria or not, they say sometimes, sorry, or you can proceed. It's like that. So survivorship bias. I hope you got an idea of what is sampling bias and different types of sampling bias. Next, coming to another one, sampling error. Error is a mistake. So how much ever careful we are when we are selecting the population, and from that taking selecting the sample, here exact matching does not occur because of certain characteristics which are present in the sample, like traits. There is an individual difference from person to person, and we are aware of it. So when we say sampling error, it is a deviation from the selected sample from true characteristics like traits, behaviors, qualities, or the figures of the entire population. So some of the sampling errors are like lack of sample representativeness, difficulty in estimation of sample size. So lack of sample representativeness includes like these characteristics differ from individual to individual. And estimation of sample size, you want to generalize population, then you have to uh, take a sample which can be representative to the population and which can give us a correct result. If you just over represent or under represent, it leads to sampling bias as well as sampling errors. The another thing is lack of resources. Resources which we want to conduct a study. Suppose, for example, if you want to conduct a study on a population, giving them like an intervention or an experimental study where you just treat them with something, want to treat them. For example, let me say, maybe applying some gel, efficacy of some pain relief gel on the persons if they're having some knee joint pains or something like that, and see the effectiveness, and you don't have a gel and you want to apply that gel for 1 week, and whereas the gel finished in 5 days and the remaining 2 days you didn't apply, you will not get correct result, isn't it? So lack of resources, lack of cooperation from the participants, lack of existing appropriate sampling frames for larger population. Maybe the sample got involved in first day, second day, then the sample, the person subject rejected or subject missed involving in study. So lack of existing appropriate sampling frames for larger population. Sometimes callous approach, it is a casual approach of the researcher towards the sampling process. He thinks, a researcher, he is not aware of the how to estimate the sample size or the which sampling method should be used to select the sample, or he just casually approaches whatever, it is fine. So this leads to sampling errors. So coming to sampling error, it is key element within hypothesis testing. So sampling errors we have in type 1 error and type 2 errors. Anyway, we'll go in detail regarding those later. But it is a statistical value that indicates the difference in results found in the sample when compared to the population from which the sample is drawn. So here population mean is there and the sample mean is there, but these two does not coincide. There is a difference. Then we say sampling error has occurred between these population means. So it is very, very important when you select a sample, how much sample should be selected, and what method is used to select that sample, and the smaller sampling subjects, like sampling frame, from the frame how many subjects we are taking should be correct enough to generalize the results so that errors will be less. So it most preferably, when we say if you take the larger samples, they will reduce the errors. If you try to conduct a study on 25 members or 30 sample and try to generalize it for thousands of population, it doesn't suit, isn't it? So as much as possible, we should try to minimize the sampling errors as well as sampling bias. So you can just go through my previous video regarding different types of sampling methods which I have discussed and which are very important. So far we have discussed about sampling bias as well as sampling errors and different types of sampling bias and what are the reasons for sampling errors to occur. I hope you all had understood. Thank you all very much. We'll meet shortly in my other videos. I would like to start with the statistics as well as some of the things. So we'll meet you soon, and please don't forget to subscribe and share my channel. Thank you all very much.